Hello, and welcome to Understanding the Unmet Needs of the Pemphigus and Pemphigoid Community, our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting for Pemphigus and Pemphigoid. I'm Patrick Dunn, Executive Director of the International Pemphigus and Pemphigoid Foundation, and it's my honor to get us started on this day of elevating the voices of Pemphigus and Pemphigoid patients. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a special welcome to those in attendance from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. We are excited to have you join us today. I'd also like to thank our coalition of meeting organizers. In addition to the IPPF, today's meeting was organized by Pem Friends from the UK, the Association Pemphigus and Pemphigoid France, and the Pemphigus Pemphigoid Friends Association from Japan. Today's meeting has also greatly benefited from the ongoing involvement of the 4 clinical experts you will hear from today: Dr. Pascal Joly, Dr. Dede Morel, Dr. Amy Payne, and Dr. Victoria Worth. Thank you all for your tireless commitment to patients. I'd also like to thank the sponsors of this meeting for making today possible: argenx, AstraZeneca, Janssen, and the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. Finally, and most importantly, thank you to all the patients, family, and caregivers whose perseverance is the lifeblood of this community. This milestone event is the culmination of years of advocacy and awareness work by so many of you. Now, to see who is joining us today, we have an introductory poll to learn more about our audience. While that poll is active, I'll lay out our goals for this externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, or ELPFDD for short. Our first goal is to help identify areas of unmet needs of patients. Our second goal is to examine the need to develop tools that assess the benefits of patient therapies. And our third goal is to raise disease awareness and engage the patient community in sharing their disease experiences. To put it plainly, this is an opportunity for patients to share what it's really like to live with these diseases. Patient input can help the FDA and other stakeholders make informed decisions on future approvals of potential medicines for Pemphigus and Pemphigoid, and help pharmaceutical companies to design therapies and clinical trials that are meaningful for those who will be most affected by their outcomes. Now, why is it important for us to amplify the collective patient voice when discussing potential future therapies? Beyond the simple fact that rare autoimmune skin diseases like Pemphigus and Pemphigoid drastically affect every aspect of a patient's life, the current treatment landscape presents barriers to care that add to the already overwhelming burden presented by the symptoms of these diseases. As you will hear from both patients and disease experts today, current treatment options, such as long-term systemic steroids, can have drastic and harmful side effects for patients. More advanced treatment options available to patients have to be prescribed off-label, creating additional barriers to care in the form of payer approvals. In fact, other than steroids, this community only has one FDA-approved therapy, and that approval is limited to a single subset of these diseases, Pemphigus vulgaris. Perhaps most importantly, there is no one-size-fits-all treatment for any form of Pemphigus or Pemphigoid. Patients often have to try multiple treatment options to find their best hope for remission. This fact, when coupled with the comorbidities that often accompany the populations most affected by these diseases, means that additional and better treatment options are needed. To quote IPPF Advocacy and Research Coordinator Mark Yale, "We need more tools in the toolbox." On that note, I'm going to turn things over to both Mark Yale, mucous membrane Pemphigus and Pemphigoid patient, and Becky Strong, Pemphigus vulgaris patient, who will be our co-hosts for today.
Thanks, Patrick, and welcome everyone. I'm truly honored to co-moderate today's meeting along with Becky. As Patrick mentioned, this meeting is a product of many years of hard work to create disease awareness and a tireless effort by so many. This meeting, however, is just one step forward in the path to improving the lives of all of those affected by pemphigus and pemphigoid. I feel it's important to emphasize that this patient-focused drug development meeting is patient-led and was planned by, is moderated by, and will benefit patients in our community. I was diagnosed with pemphigoid in 2007 and have dedicated the last 15 years to advocating for myself and on behalf of the entire IPPF community. I'm sure that the burden of this disease has had as much a significant impact on your lives as it has had on mine. And we will hear many stories today that will illustrate this. We'll hear about the physical, psychological, and emotional impacts of these diseases and how they have affected our lives. We will learn what's most important to people living with pemphigus and pemphigoid and how to address the problems our community faces in the development of new therapies. Even more critical, we hope to provide new perceptions and change misconceptions about the seriousness of these rare autoimmune bullous skin diseases. I'd like to introduce my co-moderator and colleague and friend, Becky Strong.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you all for joining us today. As Patrick said earlier, I have pemphigus vulgaris. I was diagnosed in 2010 after a 17-month journey to find the correct diagnosis and have tried to raise awareness by sharing my own story. But today we're here to help the FDA understand what is important to the pemphigus and pemphigoid community, what is currently being done to help those of us with these diseases, and what needs to be done for us to receive better treatments and hopefully one day a cure. Everybody on this call plays an important role to many other people in their lives. Joining us today are mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, aunts and uncles, neighbors and friends, doctors and researchers, and even government officials. As we move through the day, I encourage you to think about somebody in your life and that you care about going through similar situations as we listen to the experiences being shared. No matter how we fit into the puzzle, we are an important part of today's meeting. I thank you each again for being here today. Those of you from the FDA who have a direct impact on patients like us and the treatments that are available to us, to industry partners, researchers, and doctors looking for better treatments and care for patients, to each person directly or indirectly affected by pemphigus and pemphigoid. Today's meeting is a little over 5 hours, and during this time, we hope you will gain insight from those sharing what life is like with these diseases and understand you're not alone. We acknowledge that it may be emotionally tough to share, to hear some of these very personal experiences and see real life photos. But we hope you understand how important it is that we share candidly how we have learned to survive and thrive when our own bodies are working against us. I encourage everybody today to be kind to themselves and to know how much we appreciate the strength you have to share your stories with us and to invest the time in listening and learning from others. Now, I'd like to move through some housekeeping items before we start our day. As a reminder, you will remain in listen-only mode through the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. For those of you who are on your computer for this meeting, you'll see on your screen that you can access the audio of today's meeting either by using your telephone to call in from or the speakers on your computer. Please click on the little caret or up arrow next to the audio settings in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. As you can see on my screen right now, you have the option to select your computer speakers or to dial in by telephone. So please choose the method that you will be using. Throughout this meeting, you'll be asked to participate in poll questions, like we already had the first one. Please know your responses are very important for the IPPF and the FDA to have. If you have a question or would like to make a comment about this meeting, please send your questions and comments to pfdd@pemphigus.org and we will respond after the meeting. Please note that the chat, Q&A, and raise your hand functions will remain off for the duration of this meeting.
So before we get into the important stuff, I want to let you know a few things about what to expect from today's meeting and what will the outcomes of the meeting be? So during the first half of today's meeting, we're going to hear patient perspectives on direct and indirect impacts of their diseases and how the impact that they've had on their health, functioning, and overall well-being. In the second session, you will hear from patients and caregivers about their preferences, treatment burdens, and unmet needs. As we mentioned, we will be polling throughout this meeting. The patient experience data is vital information that can be used to paint a picture of what it's like to live with these diseases and assess the benefits and risks associated with the treatments for pemphigus and pemphigoid. If you are an attendee who is not a patient, please don't answer these polls and just exit the poll questions when they come up. Results from the polls will be included in the Voice of the Patient report and shared with our stakeholders to help influence their perception of these diseases. So what is the Voice of the Patient report, you might ask? The report is not only serves as a summary of the meeting, but it can also be used as guidance for industry, FDA staff, and researchers to define the attributes, benefits, and relevance of treatments on patients. We will use today's webcast recording and its transcript to help us write this report. Both the webcast and transcript will be available online for all to see and use. We hope that these tools will be used as real-world data to show the importance of qualitative research methods, prioritize research protocols, and develop meaningful patient-reported outcome measures. I'm going to pass things back to Becky to review today's agenda, but before I do, I would like to launch another quick poll so we can hear how your disease may have affected your work life or study. Over to you, Becky.
Thanks, Mark. So today's meeting is very full with lots of important topics to our community. As I go over today's agenda, please take a moment to answer the following question. What prescription medications have you tried for your condition? We will begin today's meeting with some opening remarks from Dr. Sherry Targum, who's the Deputy Director of the Division of Dermatology and Dentistry in the Office of Immunology and Inflammation from the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. After that, Dr. Pascal Joly will discuss the background of pemphigus and pemphigoid, and following Dr. Joly, Dr. Amy Payne will share the current treatments and limitations for our diseases. We will then share the patient voice through patient panels, videos, and an open comment period to discuss the diseases and how they affect daily life. After a break, we will return to hear Dr. Dede Morel discuss the lack of healthcare treatments in awareness and education. Then Dr. Victoria Worth will explain clinical trial experience and meaningful benefits to patients. Our second patient voice panel will then discuss patients' perspective on available treatments for the diseases and side effects and how to improve them. Please know that there will also be lots of times to share your opinion through polling and open discussion.
So as I introduce our next speaker, I encourage you to participate in our next poll question about whether your disease made you feel anxious or not. So our first speaker is Dr. Sherry Targum, MD, MPH. Dr. Targum earned her medical degree from the NYU Grossman School of Medicine and master's degree in public health from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She is the Deputy Director, Division of Dermatology and Dentistry. She at the Office of Immunology and Inflammation, at the Office of New Drugs in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, also known as CDER, at the FDA. She brings over 30 years of regulatory industry and clinical experience. And so I'd like to have everybody please join me in welcoming Dr. Sherry Targum, who will be speaking today about patient-focused drug development at the FDA. And welcome, Dr. Targum.
Thank you very much. My name is Sherry Targum, and it is an honor to be with you today. The Patient-Focused Drug Development Program, or PFDD, began 11 years ago when the FDA recognized a need for more systematic ways of gathering patient perspectives on their condition and treatment options. Patient-focused drug development is an approach to help ensure that patient experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into drug development and evaluation. In the years that followed, FDA conducted dozens of PFDD meetings, giving patients and caregivers a platform to contribute input that can inform drug development and evaluation. We've learned a great deal from the patients who have participated. What it's like to live with your condition and your symptoms and daily function, what an ideal treatment looks like. Some patients want to be active in the work to develop and evaluate new treatments, and participating in today's meeting is one way to do this. FDA protects and promotes public health by evaluating the safety, effectiveness, and quality of new products. But we do not develop the medical products or conduct clinical trials. It is, however, FDA's responsibility to ensure that the benefits of a product outweigh its risks. Therefore, having this kind of dialogue is extremely valuable for us, because hearing what you care about and what matters to you can help us lead the way in figuring out how to facilitate development of treatments for pemphigus and pemphigoid, and understand how patients and caregivers view the benefits and risks of treatments for pemphigus and pemphigoid. For those of you who are patients, we would like to hear what specific things you look for in an ideal treatment to manage your condition. This will help inform the focus of new drug development and future trials. Your input collected from these meetings can help identify areas of unmet need, such as an aspect of your condition that might not be addressed in current treatments. Your input may also help developers as they identify or create tools that are used to measure the benefit of potential treatment. I would like to thank the International Pemphigus and Pemphigoid Foundation and the staff involved in planning this meeting. Your input and perspectives really help us and will also help industry and academia to move the drug development process forward to ensure that new medications meet the needs of people living with pemphigus and pemphigoid. We are all here today to hear the voice of the patient, so thank you for your participation. We are grateful to each of you for being here and sharing your personal stories, experiences, and perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Targum, for educating us about patient-focused drug development at the FDA. It really is much clearer now how the patient experience data that we plan to collect from today's meeting will help to play a crucial role in supporting medical product development and regulatory decision-making. I'd like to, as I introduce our next speaker, I encourage you to participate in our next poll question about how your disease made you feel about your appearance. And while you're answering that question, I just want to make sure we have our next speaker on the line here. So let me just take a look and make sure he's here. He's calling in all the way from France today, so we appreciate that. Okay, well, it looks like We don't have Dr. Jolie available, so we are going to move on to our next speaker. And so I'm going to pass it over to Becky to introduce our next speaker. Becky?
Thanks, Mark. As I introduce Dr. Payne, I encourage you to participate in our next poll question about your treatment regime. Dr. Amy Payne is a professor of dermatology and director of the Clinical Autoimmunity Center of Excellence at the University of Pennsylvania. She received her bachelor's in science and biology from Stanford University and her medical degree, PhD, from Washington University School of Medicine, followed by a dermatology residency at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research has investigated how autoimmunity occurs in order to develop better targeted therapies for disease, which has led to a novel precision cellular immunotherapy for mucosal pemphigus vulgaris that is currently being evaluated in a phase 1 clinical trial. Dr. Payne also serves as the Associate Director of the Penn Medical Scientist Training Program, Chair of the NIAMS Board of Scientific Counselors, and co-founder of Cavaletto Bio, focused on engineering targeted cellular immunotherapies for B-cell mediated diseases. Welcome, Dr. Payne.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Excuse me. Hold on one moment. Okay, great. Is my screen showing okay?
Yes, we can see it.
All right. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the current treatments and limitations of therapy for pemphigus and pemphigoid. As Becky Strong mentioned, I'm Amy Payne, professor of dermatology at the University of Pennsylvania, where I have a clinical practice that specializes in the diagnosis and treatment of patients with pemphigus and pemphigoid. My conflict of interest disclosures are listed at the bottom of this slide, and the views I'm about to share are my own as a physician and researcher and do not necessarily represent those of the listed organizations. So pemphigus and pemphigoid are B-cell and antibody-mediated autoimmune diseases. Understanding how disease occurs is important for understanding our strategies for treating disease. So the immune system is made up of two major groups of cells. T cells are like the generals of the army, and B cells are the soldiers of the army. And their weapons are antibodies that can bind and destroy invading pathogens like bacteria and viruses. Dr. Jolie, when his presentation is shown, will share with you many photos about how pemphigus and pemphigoid develops. But in pemphigus and pemphigoid, T cells will mistakenly call into action a rare set of rogue autoreactive B cells that, instead of fighting off foreign pathogens, mistakenly attack self and produce autoantibodies. In pemphigus, these autoantibodies are mainly of a class that we call IgG4, and they directly target proteins in the skin that are responsible for holding the skin cells together, resulting in skin blisters such as those shown here. In pemphigoid, the pathways are more complex. Antibodies of the so-called IgG1 subclass will fix complement, and they can also activate Fc-mediated inflammatory pathways. In the meantime, IgG4 antibodies can directly interfere with cell adhesion, and IgE antibodies can activate eosinophils and mast cells. Collectively, these lead to the blisters, pain, and itch that are associated with pemphigoid. Hence, current treatment strategies for pemphigus and pemphigoid aim to suppress or eliminate these disease-causing antibodies and B cells, as well as the inflammation that contributes to pain, itch, and blistering in pemphigus and pemphigoid patients. So if we look at the current treatment landscape for pemphigus and pemphigoid, it's sparse. Corticosteroids are FDA approved for pemphigus. The intravenous monoclonal antibody infusion rituximab is approved only for pemphigus vulgaris, and nothing is clinically approved for pemphigoid. Because there are so few approved therapies, and some patients may not be able to take corticosteroids and rituximab, Pemphigus patients are often prescribed off-label immunosuppressive drugs such as mycophenolate mofetil, azathioprine, or methotrexate. Another option is intravenous immunoglobulin, which is not immunosuppressive, and it works by providing good antibodies that dilute out the bad antibodies, and it also suppresses harmful immune reactions. For pemphigoid, since nothing is FDA approved, patients must be prescribed all drugs off-label. Topical or oral steroids are typically first-line therapy. Other therapies in common use include the anti-inflammatory drugs doxycycline and dapsone. Immunosuppressive drugs such as methotrexate, mycophenolate mofetil, azathioprine, and rituximab. As we mentioned for pemphigus, IVIG offers a non-immunosuppressive option for disease control. And off-label use of the anti-IgE antibody omalizumab, and more recently, the anti-IL-4/13 receptor antibody dupilumab, which is currently in a phase 3 trial for bullous pemphigoid, can offer relief of symptoms to some patients without causing global immune suppression. So how well do corticosteroids and rituximab work as first-line therapy for moderate to severe pemphigus vulgaris? Clinical studies indicate that 90% of patients treated with steroids and maintenance rituximab infusions every 6 months, starting at month 12, achieve complete remission off steroids by 2 years. In contrast, only 28% of patients achieve complete remission off steroids at the end of the 2-year study period if they were treated with high-dose steroids alone. Rituximab is also superior to mycophenolate mofetil in its steroid-sparing effect. In this pivotal study in pemphigus vulgaris, 40% of patients receiving rituximab and steroids achieved complete remission off steroids by 1 year, compared to 10% who received mycophenolate mofetil plus steroids. These 2 clinical trials contributed to the FDA approval of rituximab plus corticosteroids for pemphigus vulgaris. So these prior data show what rituximab and corticosteroids can achieve during clinical trials. But what does real-world data show when rituximab is used as part of standard care clinical practice? In this retrospective study, we examined all pemphigus vulgaris patients at a single center who were treated with rituximab and received additional rituximab infusions either to improve response or to treat relapse. We plotted patients who achieved disease remission after a single cycle of rituximab in green, those who achieved disease control with repeated rituximab infusions in yellow, those who transiently achieved remission then relapsed in orange, and finally, those who never achieved disease remission off steroids in gray. So this shows essentially a dynamic dashboard of what patient outcomes look like as a function of time after rituximab therapy. At 6 months after therapy, a little under 20% of patients have achieved remission off steroids, but for some, disease begins to relapse at 6 months, shown here as the orange bar that begins to appear at that time point. The peak response after a single cycle of rituximab occurs 12 months after the first rituximab infusion and then begins to fall, shown here in green. Additional rituximab infusions can be used to maintain disease control, shown in yellow here, but this effect maxes out at just over 40%, which is very similar to the maximum rate of complete remission observed in the prospective randomized controlled study of rituximab and corticosteroids in pemphigus published in New England Journal of Medicine. One other take-home message of these data is that the majority of pemphigus vulgaris patients treated with rituximab and steroids demonstrated relapsed or refractory disease requiring repeated rituximab infusions for symptom control, bracketed here as the group of individuals represented by the gray, orange, and yellow bars. This is the group of patients that still has significant unmet need for therapy as they potentially face years of chronic immune suppression to control their disease. So in addition, rituximab patients must deal with several risks and limitations of therapy with rituximab and corticosteroids. First, rituximab has transient effect. B cells start to repopulate roughly 6 months after rituximab infusion, so repeated infusions are required to maintain disease control. Second, repetitive rituximab infusions cause chronic B cell depletion and significant immune suppression. In the pivotal clinical trials of rituximab for Pemphigus vulgaris, there was a 4 to 9% annual rate of serious infections, meaning serious enough to require hospital level care. In addition, the average time to stop steroids was 9 months. So patients may suffer from the side effects of chronic steroids, such as insomnia, weight gain, high blood pressure, diabetes, bone fractures, infections, and more. Rituximab depletes the B cells that are necessary to mount an antibody response to vaccination. Multiple studies have reported poor antibody response to SARS-CoV-2 vaccination in patients receiving rituximab therapy, which leads to higher risk of severe infection, hospitalization, and potentially death. Because of the risks of chronic immune suppression during the pandemic, many patients feel that they can no longer safely do the things they used to do, such as gatherings with family and friends, vacation or work travel, dining out, or working in indoor office spaces. This has led to substantial social and professional isolation, in some cases forcing patients to seek other lines of work. These are the limitations of steroids and rituximab. But what about other off-label therapies for pemphigus and pemphigoid? Topical corticosteroids such as clobetasol are considered first-line therapy for pemphigoid, but patients must apply the medication neck down, which requires prescribing 8 to 10 tubes per month and may require nursing assistance for total body application. Some insurance plans only cover 1 tube per month, which lasts only a few days, and others charge copays of over $300 a month, which makes such therapies inaccessible for most patients. In addition, chronic use of steroids on the skin can cause atrophy or thinning, stretch marks, and easy bruising. Immunosuppressives such as mycophenolate mofetil, azathioprine, and methotrexate are associated with side effects that impact quality of life, including fatigue, nausea, diarrhea, serious infections. These drugs can also cause abnormalities in blood counts or liver or kidney function, which necessitates frequent blood work monitoring, particularly at the start of therapy. The advantage of intravenous immunoglobulin, or IVIG, is that it is not immunosuppressive, but infusions can cause headache, which in some situations can reflect a debilitating condition known as aseptic meningitis, and may predispose to blood clots that can lead to heart attack, stroke, or embolism. Additionally, patients must receive 3 to 5 daily infusions that are repeated every 6 weeks to start, which makes it difficult to impossible as many patients cannot take 1 week off of work every 6 weeks. Rituximab is very valuable as an option for treating refractory pemphigoid, although it does not work as well in pemphigoid compared to pemphigus. Only 12% of pemphigoid patients achieve complete remission off steroids after a single cycle of rituximab, which increases to 39% with multiple cycles of rituximab. Outcomes are better with complete remission rates of 53 to 76% if low doses of prednisone, topical steroids, or dapsone are maintained after rituximab therapy. Infectious adverse events occur in 12 to 13% of pemphigoid patients who receive repeated rituximab infusions. And more frequent relapse occurs after rituximab. The median time to relapse was roughly 6 to 12 months in these studies, so chronic maintenance infusions with rituximab are expected for pemphigoid. We think this may be due to the fact that inflammatory pathways in pemphigoid amplify the antibody-mediated effects. We know that the pemphigoid antibody levels drop after therapy, but the autoantibodies may have to be suppressed to a greater extent in pemphigoid, along with anti-inflammatory therapy, in order to fully suppress the disease symptoms. So, one of the major challenges facing patients with pemphigus and pemphigoid is that they must balance the burden of disease with burden of therapy. I have had patients hospitalized for agranulocytosis after azathioprine, sepsis, brain toxoplasmosis, pneumocystis pneumonia after rituximab and steroids. Our patients are in need of therapies that can achieve disease control without these serious side effects. This brings us to the unmet needs in pemphigus and pemphigoid. First, there are no FDA-approved drugs other than prednisone for pemphigus foliaceus, and no FDA-approved drugs for pemphigoid. These are devastating and disfiguring diseases that impair activities of everyday living. And chronic steroids are not a feasible long-term option for therapy. Because few to no therapies are FDA approved, doctors often have to spend hours appealing to insurance to have even the most basic of therapies approved to treat their disease. Options for different routes of administration are also important to our patients. Rituximab is given intravenously, which means that travel to and from the infusion centers has to be arranged. Oral, topical, or subcutaneous drugs that a patient can self-administer would be of benefit. We are in need of drugs that work fast. Most of our drugs take 3 months or more to start to have therapeutic effect. It's not easy to tolerate total body blistering or severe mouth blistering for months in a row. We're in need of drugs that are safe and well tolerated, drugs that avoid chronic immune suppression and avoid blood work to monitor blood counts, liver, and kidney function. Therapy should ideally cause minimal side effects. Finally, patients ideally want to avoid steroids, as this drug can have major impacts on quality of life for pemphigus and pemphigoid patients. In addition to weight gain, mood swings, insomnia, bruising, and stretch marks, steroids can also cause serious medical complications, including high blood pressure, diabetes, bone fractures, glaucoma, cataracts, and serious and even life-threatening infections. One final note on challenges in the drug development process for pemphigus and pemphigoid, which Professors Murrell and Worth will cover in more detail after the break. Pemphigus and pemphigoid clinical trials are increasingly being required to achieve an endpoint of clear or almost clear disease. And some trial designs involve stopping the drug, even though the mechanism of action would suggest that it requires chronic therapy to maintain its effect. In contrast, other autoimmune diseases, such as myasthenia gravis or systemic lupus erythematosus, have received clinical approvals based on only a few-point improvement in disease activity scales. The significance of this from a drug development standpoint is that a single blister will prevent a patient from achieving clear or almost clear disease. And pemphigus and pemphigoid patients have marked skin and mucosal fragility, such that even the slightest trauma can cause a blister. Let me give an example. Consider this hypothetical clinical trial patient. Before therapy, the patient had severe confluent blistering of the gums and cheeks, plus blisters on the palate, the floor of the mouth, the tongue, and the throat. The patient is unable to eat or drink. Their disease activity, as measured by the Pemphigus Disease Area Index, or PDAI, is 42. And their disease activity, as measured by the investigator's global assessment, or IGA, is 4, both reflecting severe disease. After therapy, the patient cleared. However, on the clinical trial follow-up assessment, the patient developed one blister that appeared after eating lunch. They say it will likely go away in a day. The PDAI score is 1, but under the current IGA scale that is being requested by the FDA, the IGA score would be 2, because a single blister prevents the patient from being classified as almost clear. This patient would be considered a treatment failure based on the IGA. So the question I pose to the community is whether pemphigus and pemphigoid endpoints are appropriate relative to the burden of disease and the risks and limitations of current therapies. Thank you. We're grateful to the FDA for listening to our perspectives and working to develop patient-centered therapies to bring to approval.
Thank you, Dr. Payne, for explaining the current treatments that are available for these diseases and their limitations. At this time, I'm going to ask the community to take a poll, take a moment and respond to our next poll. So as Dr. Payne pointed out, the landscape is sparse in treatments for the diseases, with only corticosteroid and rituximab being approved for pemphigus vulgaris and no approved therapies for pemphigoid. This creates challenges for patients as most drugs must be prescribed as off-label. Additionally, the real-world data you shared illustrates the real threat of disease relapse for patients. Not to mention, in today's COVID environment, the risk of chronic B-cell depletion and immunosuppression is a real concern for many patients. Most importantly, however, are the side effects from the chronic use of steroids, which in most cases have a debilitating effect on patients. The challenges faced by patients in balancing the burden of disease versus the burden of therapy can be immense. We need therapies that control our disease without serious side effects and clinical trials that utilize the appropriate endpoints that represent what is most important to patients. Thank you again, Dr. Payne. At this time, I'm going to pass things over to Mark to introduce our next distinguished speaker.
Thanks, Becky. Appreciate that. And I'm going to, as I introduce our next speaker, I encourage you to participate in our next poll about how your disease made you feel about your appearance, or I'm sorry, about how whether your disease made you feel depressed or sad. So please take a moment to participate in that poll while I introduce our next speaker. And our next speaker is Professor Pascal Joly, Professor Joly is the professor of dermatology and the head of the Department of Dermatology at the Centre Hospitalier University Rouen in Rouen, France. He is also the head of the French Reference Center for Autoimmune Blistering Diseases. Professor Joly's main areas of interest are immunodermatology as well as oncodermatology, including basic research and clinical and therapeutic trials on autoimmune blistering skin diseases, in addition to drug-induced reactions. Professor Joly has published over 500 articles in peer-reviewed journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, the Lancet, and the Journal of Investigative Dermatology. He is an editorial board member of the British Journal of Dermatology and a reviewer of numerous journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, BMJ, Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology, of the American Academy of Dermatology, and the European Journal of Dermatology. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished professor, Professor Joly, as he presents on the background of pemphigus and pemphigoid. Welcome, Professor Joly.
Hello.
And you can feel free to go ahead and share your slides now.
You have my slides, no? I previously sent my presentation.
Oh, did you want us to share your slides? I thought you were sharing your slides.
No, I prefer you share my slides.
You prefer us to share slides. Okay, so let me go ahead and bring those up. Bear with me here just a second. Actually. Okay, Anna, go ahead and share. If you can, you have them ready. And then Dr. Joly, Professor Joly, just let us know when you'd like us to advance those slides. Bear with us just 1 second here. maybe while we're pulling up these slides for Professor Jolie, maybe we can go ahead and launch the next poll. And are you able to get the slides up? Okay, I think they're up now. Can you see them, Dr. Jolie?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so just let me know when you'd like me to advance them.
Okay. So let's go. So good morning, everybody. So I have been asked to present a rapid overview on the background of pemphigus and pemphigoid in order to introduce the issues that we will further discuss. The autoimmune blistering diseases are an heterogeneous group of blistering diseases which affects both the skin and mucosa to different extents. Autoimmune blistering diseases are classified into two groups depending on the location of autoantibody deposits. The pemphigus group, which is related to the production of autoantibodies directed against various adhesion proteins of the desmosomes, mainly corresponding to desmogleins, which belong to the cadherin family and are characterized by histologically by intraepidermal blisters. And the second group is the pemphigoid group, which is related to the production of autoantibodies directed against various adhesion proteins of the dermal epidermal junction, mainly BP180. And this group is characterized histologically by a dermal epidermal cleavage. Next slide. Next slide, please. So pemphigus and pemphigoid are rare autoimmune diseases. The incidence of pemphigus is between 1 to 6 cases per million inhabitants per year. And this incidence increases up to 20 cases per million per year in some endemic areas such as Tunisia and Brazil. Pemphigus is a severe disease with a 1-year mortality rate around 10%. And interestingly, in two recent European studies, the mortality rates of patients with pemphigus foliaceus, which is often considered as a benign disease, was in fact higher than the mortality rate of patients with pemphigus vulgaris, which was mainly related to the fact that PF patients were older than PD patients. Next slide, please. BP, bullous pemphigoid, is the most frequent autoimmune blue skin disease, with an incidence rate of 13 new cases per million inhabitants per year in Europe. Because BP mainly affects elderly patients, the incidence rates of BP in patients older than 85 years old is extremely high, around 500 cases per million inhabitants per year, which shows that BP is not a rare disease in the elderly. BP is a very severe disease with a 1-year mortality rate between 20 to 30% and a standardized mortality ratio of 3 relative to the age-adjusted general population. Next slide. In pemphigus, the binding of anti-desmoglein antibodies on the desmosomes induces the disruption of desmosomes and the separation of the keratinocyte plasma membrane, leading to the so-called acantholysis phenomenon and the formation of an intraepidermal blister. In BP, the binding of autoantibodies on the desmosomes induces the recruitment of neutrophils and eosinophils and the release of proteolytic enzymes that leads to the separation of the dermal-epidermal junction. Importantly, autoantibodies, both in pemphigus and pemphigoid, are pathogenic, as demonstrated in vitro and in vivo animal models. Next slide. Next. Next. Two main types of pemphigus have been identified. Pemphigus vulgaris, which accounts for around 70% of cases in the US and Europe, and Pemphigus foliaceus, which correspond to around 20% of cases. Anti-desmoglein 1 antibodies are responsible for skin lesions, while anti-desmoglein 3 antibodies are responsible for mucosal lesions. Because the roof of intraepidermal blisters is very thin and fragile, patients rapidly have painful skin and mucosal erosions, which may sometimes be extensive in some patients. Next. Pemphigus vulgaris often starts with painful oral lesions, as you can see on this slide. Next. Or genital lesions. Next. Or esophageal lesions leading to dysphagia and weight loss, which is currently around -5 kilos and sometimes more. Next. Skin involvement secondarily occurs, involving the scalp, folds. Next. With extensive and painful erosive areas, as in these patients. Next. Next. And with sometimes life-threatening extensive forms with a high risk of septic shock and renal failure. Next. Skin lesions in Pemphigus foliaceus preferentially occurs on seborrheic areas of the upper trunk, and strangely, PF is often considered as a benign disease, while PF patients may have extensive lesions and often have a more relapsing course than PV patients. Next. Next. And this has been taken into account in the European guidelines, which mentions that there is no evidence from the literature that PV or PF must be treated in a different way. Next. Let's move to BP. The initial symptoms of BP is a severe pruritus. Then large stem blisters occur with urticarial lesions. BP is often associated with debilitating neurological conditions, in particular stroke, dementia, and Parkinson's disease. BP may be induced by drugs, in particular gliptins, diuretics, and more recently, anti-PD-1 or anti-PD-L1 therapies. Next. BP lesions are quite often extensive, with a major impairment of patients' quality of life due to pruritus, sleep disturbance, and painful lesions. Next. Blisters can occur on all parts of the body surface. Next. They may be very large, secondary leading to large erosive areas, which may be difficult to epithelialize in elderly patients with frequent undernourishment. Next. Non-bullous atypical types of BP account for approximately 20% of cases and include urticarial types of BP. Next. Or eczematous types. Next. Or prurigo-like types. Next. Or drosiform-like lesions. Next. Main complaints of patients are pruritus, pain, which is related to both erosive mucosal lesions, leading to dysphagia, weight loss, and genital, anal lesions, and skin lesions. Sleep disturbance, fatigue, and corticosteroid side effects, which are due to both the use of high doses of corticosteroids at the start of treatment and high cumulative doses of corticosteroids. Anxiety about the dangerousness of treatment, fear of relapses, fear of having to take corticosteroid again are frequently reported by the patients. Next. Globally, the aims of treatment are immunologically to stop the production of autoantibodies and to stop the inflammatory phenomena, and clinically to obtain a complete healing of the blistering eruption, the disappearance of the functional impairments associated with the disease, in particular pain, dysphagia, weight loss, infection, to improve the quality of life of the patients, to prevent or at least to limit the appearance of recurrences, and of course to limit treatment side effects, which are commonly related to corticosteroids and immunosuppressants. Next. I think that this should be the last slide. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dr. Jolie. Really appreciate your presentation, and thanks for your patience on our minor technical difficulties. Your presentation on the comprehensive background of the diseases, I think, really makes clear that autoimmune blistering diseases can really have, be severe and life-threatening. So thank you so much for this great presentation. The pain and fear associated with these diseases can really cause a significant impairment and the burden on the day-to-day lives of patients. And I think your presentation really illustrated that. It was also evident that there's really a need for more treatments that address both the long-term and short-term effects of the diseases. And so thank you so much again for your presentation today. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Becky. And Becky's going to introduce some patient videos that we have. So Becky, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. We'll now share some patients' perspective videos regarding their disease symptoms and the treatment and how both of these affected their daily lives.
Hello, my name is Andy Heath and I was diagnosed with Pemphigus vulgaris about 3 years ago. I had a serious flare, but the symptoms started gradually. They started on my forehead, my scalp, my chest, in my mouth, inside my nose and a little bit in my eyes and the back of my throat. And then a few weeks later, overnight, I suddenly had 100 blisters all over my body. I was given high dose 80 milligrams of prednisolone and mycophenolate, and I used topical steroids in the mouth, and ointments and creams, and a shampoo which I couldn't use because my scalp was so bad. The scalp remained very painful for 6 weeks. For the first 2 weeks I couldn't lay my head down at all, so I wasn't able to sleep. I lost a lot of hair. My hair came out in clumps. I now keep it short just in case it happens again, so I can get some topical steroid in there. My forehead became extremely blistered, and the blisters were working their way down to the eyes. So for many weeks I couldn't really eat properly. There were days when I couldn't breathe very well, and I had a lot of difficulty swallowing. The prednisolone induced hypomania, which is particularly worrying for me because 30 years ago I was diagnosed with bipolar affective disorder, and I've had several serious episodes, but I was okay because I had support. I couldn't drive for several months because the chest wounds didn't allow me to use a seatbelt. I'd sort of coped with all of this for about 4 weeks after being diagnosed. And then suddenly I scratched behind my right ear, and a 1-inch square piece of skin came away, and I just freaked out, and I thought, if I'm going to start losing skin like this, I'm in really serious trouble. I didn't, but I was very, very scared, and it was very, very unpleasant. The mycophenolate didn't work. I had a round of rituximab, and then a year later I had another round of rituximab. The infusions were just before and during the COVID pandemic, and my partner and I were strongly advised to completely isolate, even when others had started to mix. The rituximab works, and I now meet the technicals for being in remission, but I still have a blister in my mouth today and one on my perineum, and I'm treating these with topicals, and I have osteoporosis caused by the steroid. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Janelle Franklin, and I was diagnosed with Pemphigus vulgaris in May of 2021. Whenever I'm thinking about sharing my experiences, I hesitate because when compared to the horrific experiences of others with this disease, I feel I was very lucky. I was diagnosed very quickly after only having symptoms for about 2 months. I was unable to start treatment a month and a half after that. I have an excellent doctor who listens to me and trusts my judgment, and we plan my care together. I am a nurse, and I feel like this gives me an advantage in learning about my disease and using all the resources provided by the IPPF experts. I have time, knowledge, financial and medical resources to advocate for the best treatments available. So sometimes I feel like my experience is not as bad as others, and I try to minimize my experience. But even with all those helpful resources, this disease has been a life-altering disease. The intense pain that I experienced before I began treatment made it difficult to eat or sleep. Every day I worry that the little sores I have will turn into a full-blown flare and that I will experience that pain again. I am still recovering from the emotional trauma of being diagnosed with an autoimmune disease and finding myself being immunocompromised in the middle of a pandemic, especially since I live in an area where armed mobs loudly protested vaccines and any public health measures. I felt like the community around me did not care, that I was more at risk for COVID, and it has taken me a long time to recover from that fear and from the loss of faith in humanity. I've had to change my life significantly. I love to travel, and now traveling comes with more risk and worry about catching an infection or having a flare. I travel with steroid gels and pastes to treat sores and a bottle of prednisone tablets in case I have a severe flare. I don't want to experience the pain of having sores all over my mouth and throat again. My family now has to take extra precautions to avoid infections, and this has been difficult for my teenage children, who are often the only ones wearing masks, and for my husband, who's exposed to so much in his work in the emergency room. I've also had my future plans altered. I had hoped to do some medical mission work with my husband when he retires, but I don't know if that will be possible now. I worry about traveling to third world countries and not having access to adequate health care and expensive rituximab infusions every 6 to 12 months. Living with this disease has changed my life forever, and I am one of the lucky ones who has had everything go right with a quick diagnosis and the best treatments available. Thank you for allowing me to share my experiences.
Hello, my name is Doreen Gonzalez, and in June of 2022, I was diagnosed by means of a biopsy conducted on my back of Pemphigus foliaceus, an autoimmune condition. The symptoms that I experienced began with itchiness of my skin and then the appearance of blisters. At first, they began in my ears and my lower back, but then progressed to my entire back, my stomach, chest, breasts, underarms, shoulders, neck, face, and scalp. I believe that the blisters in my scalp are causing my hair to fall out, in addition to the medication that I'm currently on or the infusions that I have received. In August, I woke up one morning and could not open my eyes and was admitted to the hospital, where I was observed by the dermatology department as well as ophthalmology. I was then prescribed 80 milligrams of prednisone, 1,500 milligrams of Cellcept twice daily, doxycycline, pantoprazole, niacinamide, as well as various ointments, topical ointments for the blisters on my body. The pain was unbearable at times, especially if the blisters had the opportunity to dry up. So I was prescribed oxycodone for those times. The medication caused insomnia, headaches, dizziness, confusion, anxiety. I was unable to drive once I arrived home. I had to be visited by a nurse to help me to apply the ointment to my back, especially after showers. My skin would be very dry and painful. I received the Rituxan infusion in September and then again in October, and I am scheduled for one more in March. The infusions and medications have made my life a lot easier with regard to the blisters, as they have disappeared, but the pigmentation to my skin still exists. I still have headaches and dizziness and lightheadedness as well. I have just been diagnosed with diabetes. My A1C level is 7.3. I believe that's a cause of the medication that I'm presently on. I am very grateful for the medication. However, the side effects are very debilitating to me. I have since been able to drive, and now I'm able to go to the supermarket on my own, where I wasn't before. Thank you so much for your time.
My name is Wanda Whiting, and I'm from Michigan. In May of 2021, I was correctly diagnosed with linear IgA bullous dermatosis. I had blisters over 14 areas of my body. I became depressed. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. I didn't want to be around other people. The blisters were noticeable if I wore sleeveless tops. I had to wear loose clothing because anything that touched my legs or groin would irritate the skin. The worst part for me having this disease was the impact on me mentally. I couldn't sleep as well. I had the itching, so my mood was affected then. I felt like no one would want me. It's an awful, awful way to feel. I wish my doctors would have asked me how are you handling this? That needs to be considered, because there's no way anyone experiencing all the lesions and blisters in the areas that I had, that they wouldn't feel depressed. Thankfully, I was wearing a mask, so no one could see the blisters that were beneath my nostrils.
Wow, I just want to thank Andy and Janelle, Doreen, and Wanda for sharing, being brave and sharing your stories about your disease experience. Very powerful.